Put the phone down.
I have the right to record this interaction, officer.
Open all the windows. All of them.
Why do you want to open all the windows? Can you call your supervisor, please?
There's no supervisor. I'm the most senior officer here. You want me to make your life difficult?
You selling drugs tonight, gangbanger? What are we doing out here?
I'm not selling drugs. I'm not in a gang. I already told you who I am. I want you to see exactly who I am.
What is this? Is this fake?
The officer didn't even lean in like he was talking to a human being. He stood at Devin Reed's window and started barking over and over, telling him to put the phone down. Like the phone was the real crime. Devin stayed still, hands visible, voice controlled. He told the officer the phone was mounted and recording, and that's when the officer switched to another demand. He ordered Devin to open all the windows. Devin, still calm, asked why the officer wanted all the windows open. The officer didn't answer. He mocked him. Then, like he wanted Devin to understand who was in charge, he threatened him. He basically said, if Devin wanted, the officer could make Devin's life difficult. And he said it like he enjoyed doing that to people. And in that moment, you could feel it. This wasn't a normal traffic stop anymore. This was a power play. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Country, state, city, anywhere. And if you're into stories where somebody stays calm under pressure and the truth catches up to the loudest person in the room, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this one. All right, rewind with me, because how Devin ended up in this exact moment matters. Devin Reed wasn't reckless. He wasn't flashy. He was the type of man who moved through the world with quiet discipline because his job demanded it. He was mid-30s, clean-cut, dressed plain on purpose. Hoodie, jeans, nothing that screamed for attention. The kind of guy you'd pass in a parking lot and never remember, which was exactly how Devin liked it on his off hours. That night, he'd been driving home from a long day that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with exhaustion. The kind of day where your brain feels packed with details you can't afford to forget. The road had thinned out as he left the busier part of town. Fewer cars. And then it happened. Red and blue flashed behind him. Devin didn't do what panic makes people do. He signaled. He slowed down smoothly. He rolled forward until he reached a bright open area near a gas station entrance. Devin kept his hands visible and started recording on his phone. Not in a dramatic way. Not with an announcement like he was trying to provoke anyone. And when the patrol car stopped behind him at an angle, headlights washing the inside of his car, Devin took a breath and prepared for a normal interaction. License, registration, reason for stop. Maybe a warning. That's what a normal stop feels like. Devin kept his posture calm. He didn't give the officer anything that could be twisted into a threat. And then the first words out of that officer's mouth weren't a greeting. No introduction, no reason for the stop. Just that demand, over and over, ordering Devin to put the phone down. Devin told him the phone was mounted, that it was recording, and that his hands were visible. And that should have been the end of that issue. But the officer didn't want end. He wanted obedience. So he kept pushing. He demanded the windows, all of them, like Devin's car, needed to be opened up like a display case. Devin asked why. And that simple question, why, hit the officer like disrespect. That's when the mocking started. The officer called him a little weirdo. That's when the threat came out. And Devin realized something in real time. This officer wasn't responding to danger. He was responding to being challenged by calm confidence. So Devin did the next smartest thing a person can do when they feel a situation slipping away from routine and into personal. He asked for oversight. He asked the officer to call a supervisor, and the officer shut it down immediately. He claimed there was no supervisor. He claimed he was the most senior officer. Now think about that. In any real system, police, school, job, anything, there is always someone above you. Someone who answers for what happens. So when someone says there's nobody above them, what they're really saying is they want the scene to stay exactly how it is, just you and them. No witnesses with authority, no accountability in the moment. Devin didn't argue, he got precise. He asked the officer to identify himself and state the reason for the stop. And that's when the officer's tone shifted again, like he'd decided questions were done. The officer ordered Devin out of the vehicle. Devin paused, not to refuse, but to measure his next move. So Devin kept his voice steady and asked if he was being detained or arrested. The officer didn't give clean clarity. He answered in that vague, slippery way that leaves the officer room to justify whatever comes next. And right before Devin opened the door, the officer gave him one last push to stop recording, like the recording itself was the enemy. Devin didn't stop. He made sure the camera kept seeing what was happening. And then Devin opened the door and stepped out into the gas station light. Because Devin Reed knew something the officer didn't know yet. And in about 30 seconds, that officer was going to find out. The second Devin stepped out, the officer moved in close, too close, like he was trying to shrink the space around him. The officer told Devin to turn around and put his hands where he could see them. Devin complied without sudden movements. He kept his voice steady and reminded the officer he was recording. That didn't calm the officer down. It irritated him. The officer started patting him down immediately, not like a routine safety check, but like he was shopping for a reason to escalate. The officer kept tossing out accusations, asking if Devin was selling drugs, asking if he was in a gang, trying to paint a picture before any facts were on the table. Devin didn't argue with the insults. He didn't plead. He just kept asking for the basic things that should have been simple: the reason for the stop, the officer's name, and a supervisor. The officer shut the supervisor request down again, repeating that there was nobody else to call, that he was the senior officer. And then, to make it clear he was in control, the officer said Devin was being detained. That's when the cuffs came out. Not because Devin resisted, not because Devin threatened anyone, because the officer wanted the scene to look like Devin had earned them. Devin's wrists were pulled behind him. The metal clicked, and Devin, still calm, told the officer to check them for tightness and asked again for a supervisor. The officer didn't answer the request. He went back to fishing for a narrative. He kept asking Devin what he was really doing out there, like driving at night needed an explanation. Then the officer reached for Devin's wallet. The officer opened it, flipped through, and you could feel the exact second the officer's confidence wobbled because he didn't find what he expected. He found a credential case. Devin was an FBI. He pulled it out like it was evidence. Then his voice changed. Not louder, sharper. Suspicious in a different way. The officer demanded to know what it was. Devin told him what it was. And the officer froze. He stared at it, looked back at Devin, and said, like he couldn't decide whether to panic or accuse, asking if it was fake. That's the moment the entire stop tilted. Because now the officer wasn't dealing with a driver. He was staring at a federal badge, while his own body camera and Devin's phone were still rolling, and Devin was still in handcuffs. The officer stopped talking like a bully and started talking like a man buying time. He stepped a half pace back, still holding Devin's credentials, and radioed in fast, asking dispatch to verify a federal ID. His voice was different now, tighter, careful, suddenly aware of every word being recorded. The officer didn't argue anymore. He stalled. He kept looking from the credential case to Devin's face, like he was trying to figure out how to reverse the last 5 minutes. Then a second patrol car rolled in. Officer Priya Desai stepped out and immediately read the scene. A calm driver in cuffs, one officer keyed up, and a credential case in the first officer's hand. Desai didn't match the energy. She asked what the stop was for, why the driver was cuffed, and what exactly had been found that justified detaining him. The first officer gave vague answers. Nothing clean, nothing specific. He kept it general, like officer safety, like he wasn't cooperating, like suspicious behavior. Desai didn't accept the fog. She asked for the driver's name and identification, then looked at the credential herself. And that was the moment the error changed. Desai's tone went professional and quiet. She told the first officer plainly that they needed a watch commander, not later, now. So the radio call happened, the one the first officer said didn't exist. Within minutes, the first officer was no longer acting like the most senior person in the world. He was watching his own story collapse. His voice softened. He spoke to Devin like they'd been having a respectful conversation the whole time. But Devin didn't rush to wrap it up. He stayed calm and insisted on the basics: names, badge numbers, the reason for the stop, and confirmation that the body camera footage would be preserved. That's when the cuffs finally came off. And the first officer, who had been threatening to make Devin's life difficult, switched to polite phrases, thanking him, telling him to have a good night, acting like he appreciated him. It happened because the officer realized who Devin was. Devin didn't treat the roadside release like a happy ending. He treated it like the end of scene 1. As soon as he was away from the officers, he parked somewhere public and well-lit, and did what trained investigators do when they know a story is about to get cleaned up on paper. He locked in the facts while they were still fresh. He saved the recording in more than one place. He wrote a short timeline with exact details: time, location, sequence of orders, the escalation, the detainment, and the sudden tone change once his credentials were noticed. He kept it factual and tight, because emotional language is easy to dismiss, but a clear timeline is hard to argue with. Then he went straight to the system. He requested the official records tied to the stop: body camera, dash camera, dispatch, and radio traffic, and the written report that would be generated afterward. He also filed a formal complaint through the proper channels, making it clear this wasn't about being upset. It was about conduct, procedure, and accountability. Once the complaint was officially logged and the footage requests were in motion, the situation stopped being a he said. It became a file, a case number, a chain of emails, deadlines. Internal Affairs pulled the full body cam and dash footage, dispatch logs, timestamps. Then came interviews. Krause had to explain why he escalated so quickly, why he made personal threats, why he mocked the driver, why he claimed there was no supervisor, and what legal reason justified detaining someone who wasn't resisting. And that's where it got ugly for him, because vague explanations don't hold up when video exists. Officer safety only goes so far when the driver is calm, hands visible, and asking for basic oversight. Within days, the officer was placed under a review, and his supervisors started asking the kind of questions that don't come with friendly answers. Meanwhile, Devin kept doing one thing: staying disciplined. He didn't turn it into a social media war. He didn't chase clout. He responded in writing, showed up when asked, and kept everything centered on conduct and policy: what was said, what was done, and what should never happen on a routine stop. And eventually, consequences started forming. Maybe it was suspension. Maybe it was a reassignment. Maybe it was a resignation timed to look voluntary. Maybe it was termination after findings came back. However it landed, the key point was this: the system couldn't pretend it was nothing, because the footage wasn't nothing. And the department couldn't ignore how bad it looked. That respect only appeared after the driver status was revealed. That's when the policy conversations started. The part departments hate, but communities need. Supervisors reviewing stop protocols, clearer rules about recording, stricter requirements for detainment and cuffs, mandatory supervisor notification when a stop escalates without a clear legal basis. And Devin didn't frame it as revenge. He framed it as prevention, because the next person might not have credentials. The next person might not have training. The next person might not walk away with nothing but anger. Weeks later, the stop wasn't just a memory for Devin. It was a reference point. Because what stayed with him wasn't the flashing lights or even the cuffs. It was the pattern. How quickly respect disappeared when the officer thought he was dealing with just a guy, and how quickly it returned the second the badge came out. And that's the real lesson, not be calm and it'll be fine. Devin was calm the whole time. The lesson was documentation changes outcomes. And accountability only works when there's a record strong enough to survive excuses. Devin didn't walk away thinking he won. He walked away thinking about the next person who gets pulled over in the dark, without training, without confidence, without a way to preserve what happened. The person who gets labeled before they even speak. The person whose calm still gets treated like a threat. So, he did the only thing that actually protects people long term. He forced the system to look at itself. Not with shouting, not with revenge, with facts, with timestamps, with oversight. And maybe that doesn't feel dramatic in the moment, but it's how real change happens. Quiet, boring, undeniable. Now, I want to ask you something. If you were Devin, what would you have done differently, if anything? And if you've ever had a routine situation turn into a power trip, tell your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear they're not alone. If you want more real, grounded stories like this, where dignity stays steady and accountability catches up, hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
You know why I stopped you, right? You chirped your tires back there. Sounded like you were trying to show off.
I'm in a rental performance car, sir. The throttle's touchy. I'm not out here racing anybody. I'm just in town for a birthday.
Turn around, put your hands behind your back.
For a tire chirp, I'm cooperating. I gave you my information.
We're detaining you for racing on highways. Turn around, hands behind your back.
This happened in a city where a Friday night can feel like a test you didn't sign up for. The body camera caught every detail in sharp clarity. The hard edges of streetlight glare, the quickened breathing, the shift in tone that tells you a situation is slipping out of normal and into something else. And the man standing beside that rental performance car had no idea that the next few seconds would decide how his entire weekend ended. Because this wasn't some reckless stranger the officers had been chasing. This was Malik Harmon, black, Chicago police officer, off duty, in Tempe, Arizona on August 23rd, 2021, for a friend's birthday. And he was about to be treated like a criminal over a sound most people wouldn't even remember by morning. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button now. You won't believe how fast this escalated, or how it followed him all the way into a courtroom and beyond. Thank you, and let's continue. It started the way a lot of travel weekends start. Harmon had flown in to celebrate a friend. Nothing dramatic, nothing political, just a birthday and a group of people trying to squeeze some joy out of a busy life. The kind of weekend where plans change every hour. Somebody picks a spot, somebody else is running late, somebody insists on one more stop, and everybody's phone is buzzing nonstop. Harmon wasn't in Arizona to be Officer Harmon. He was there to be Malik. So he did what travelers do. He rented a car, and he didn't rent something forgettable. It was a performance rental, the kind of car that looks expensive under streetlights and sounds like it's doing more than it actually is. The kind of car with a throttle that responds instantly, a back end that can chirp if your foot is a little heavy leaving a light, and an engine note that turns heads even when you're driving completely normal. That detail matters more than people want to admit. Because certain cars come with a stereotype attached. And on weekend nights, stereotypes move faster than facts. Tempe, like a lot of cities, has officers who hear the same complaints over and over. Engines revving, loud exhaust, drivers showing off, the fear of street racing. And once racing becomes part of the culture of a shift, it becomes a label that can swallow smaller realities whole. Now, that night, the claim from Tempe officers was that Harmon chirped or squealed his tires. That was the reason, a tire sound. The kind of thing that in most places gets handled like a minor traffic issue, maybe a warning, maybe a citation, and then everyone moves on with their night. But the way the stop unfolded didn't match the size of the accusation. The patrol lights lit up behind him, painting the inside of the car in red and blue pulses. Harmon did what any careful driver would do, what any trained officer would do, especially someone who understands traffic stops from both sides. He slowed down, signaled, and pulled over safely. No sudden movements, no drama, just routine. A flashlight beam hit the window as the officer approached, and right away the energy came in sharp. Not conversational, not let's clear this up, but command-driven. The officer confronted him about the tire sound. The officer framed it like it meant something bigger than a small mistake in a touchy rental car. Harmon kept his posture controlled, his hands visible, his tone steady. He didn't act like someone trying to win a roadside argument. He acted like someone trying to keep a situation from becoming one. He acknowledged the claim. He made it clear he wasn't there racing anyone. He tried to keep it simple, but instead of the stop settling into the normal rhythm, license, registration, maybe a warning, the officer pushed it forward fast. The officer ordered Harmon out of the vehicle almost immediately. Now, technically, officers can do that during a stop. That's not the headline. The headline is how fast it happened and what came next. Because the command wasn't delivered like a routine instruction. It was delivered like the officer had already decided he didn't want a conversation. Harmon got out, and the moment he did, the scene tightened. Backup arrived quickly. Another unit, another officer stepping in close. The kind of rapid reinforcement that changes the temperature of a simple stop. Suddenly, it wasn't just one officer addressing a minor issue. It was multiple uniforms, multiple voices, a growing sense that the stop had been mentally upgraded to something serious, whether the facts supported that or not. And then, in full view of those flashing lights, the officer ordered Harmon to put his hands behind his back. That's the moment that makes people's stomach drop, even if they've done nothing wrong. Because handcuffs don't feel like, we're going to talk. They feel like, you're already guilty in my mind. Harmon didn't flinch into chaos. He didn't give the scene the kind of emotional clip that gets replayed with captions later. He stayed controlled, steady breathing, deliberate movements, because he understood what officers often write when they want to justify escalation. Non-compliant, argumentative, aggressive. He refused to give them that. The cuffs went on anyway. Metal closed around his wrists, and the situation officially crossed the line from traffic stop to custody. And once those cuffs were on, the story had to grow. Because if all you have is a tire chirp, handcuffs look extreme. So the language expanded right there in the moment. The officers began framing the stop as racing behavior. Then came the question that exposed the gap in the accusation. The officer pressed Harmon about who he had been racing with. Think about how telling that is. Because racing usually implies another car, another driver, another participant, another person to point at. A race isn't just one person existing in a loud vehicle. A race is competition. It's two cars. It's an event. But there wasn't another vehicle being pulled over. There wasn't a second driver being questioned. There wasn't anyone else getting cuffed on the side of the road. It was just Harmon, one man in one rental car, being treated like he'd committed a group crime. And in that moment, you could feel the pivot happening. The pivot from, we're responding to what happened, to, we're defending what we already did. Because once an officer commits to cuffs, backing down feels like losing, and some people will do anything to avoid looking like they overreacted, even if the right thing is to slow down and correct course. Harmon was guided toward the patrol car and placed in the back seat. The inside of the cruiser was quiet in that specific way. Quiet but not peaceful. Quiet like you can still feel the chaos outside through the glass. Red-blue flashes bouncing across the window. The radio chatter. The sense of a normal night getting replaced by a process. And here's where the reality hit hardest. Harmon wasn't just being delayed. He was being arrested. And that meant the rest of the night wasn't going to be about birthday plans. It was going to be about booking. It was going to be about a misdemeanor charge described as racing on highways and aiding and abetting type language, even if the origin story was small. The patrol car ride wasn't long, but it was long enough for the decision to settle in. Harmon sat cuffed in the back while the officers up front talked like the outcome was already locked. One of them explained, flatly, that this wasn't being treated like a simple traffic issue. They said it was racing related, No long conversation. No, let's clear this up. Just process. When they arrived at the station, the mood didn't soften, it got colder. Harmon was walked through bright fluorescent lighting and told where to stand and where not to move. An officer instructed him to hand over everything: phone, wallet, keys, each item placed into a property bag like it didn't belong to a person anymore, just a case number. Then booking started. They took his name and basic information. They scanned his fingerprints, each finger pressed and rolled until the system accepted it. They took a booking photo under harsh light. No explanation beyond short instructions, no room for context, just steps. And then the charge was stated in the kind of language that changes how everyone hears the story, not tire chirp. But it also created a problem the officers couldn't solve with volume or authority. A racing allegation naturally raises one question: where's the other car? The hours dragged. Harmon was moved into a holding area and told to sit. The environment was loud in small ways: doors, footsteps, keys, quiet in the way that matters, because nobody was there to explain why this had to happen over something so small. Eventually, Harmon was released, not with an apology, not with a correction on the spot, just released because the system finished the overnight cycle and pushed the case forward into the court track. When he got his phone back, it was already a mess of missed calls and messages. Friends asking where he was, if he was okay, what happened, what they needed to do next. Everyone trying to make sense of how a tire chirp turned into an arrest. And now the problem wasn't just the night. The problem was what was attached to his name until it wasn't. That misdemeanor racing-related charge. Because from this point on, the roadside tone didn't matter. The command voice didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether the allegation could survive. A report that had to stay consistent. A charge that had to match actual facts. And a court process that doesn't accept "because I said so" as proof. A misdemeanor racing-related case now existed with his name on it. And it didn't matter that it started with a tire chirp. What mattered was what the officers chose to call it when they took him to jail, racing on highways and aiding and abetting type language. So the next steps were immediate and practical. Harmon had to deal with court scheduling. He had to deal with the case being active. He had to deal with the fact that the arrest wasn't a story anymore. It was a record. And the record had a problem. So when the case moved forward, it didn't last. The misdemeanor charge was later dismissed. That dismissal didn't give Harmon his night back. It didn't erase the booking. It didn't undo the humiliation of being cuffed and held. But it did confirm something important. The criminal accusation couldn't survive. And that's where the story changed direction. Because once the charge was gone, the question left standing was the question people always try to avoid. Why was he arrested in the first place? Why did a stop that started as tires chirped end with jail? Why was it handled like a street racing case, without the basic elements that usually come with one? After the misdemeanor charge got dismissed, the story didn't fade out. It hardened. Because the dismissal answered one question. The criminal case didn't hold, but it left a bigger one sitting in the middle of everything. Why did a stop for a tire chirp end with handcuffs, an arrest, and an overnight jail stay? That's when Harmon filed the civil lawsuit against the city of Tempe. And the second that lawsuit was filed, the entire stop stopped being a street moment and became evidence. The city of Tempe was served. Lawyers stepped in. And then the key move happened fast. Everything tied to that night had to be preserved and pulled. Body camera footage from every officer on scene. Dash camera footage. Dispatch and CAD logs showing the time of the stop and who was called. Radio traffic. Arrest reports and supplemental narratives. Jail booking timestamps and intake records. The exact charged language used to justify taking him in, because the lawsuit wasn't just saying, this was unfair. It was saying something sharper, that the stop escalated without a lawful basis, and that the escalation was racial profiling. A black man in a performance rental being treated like a street racer first, and a normal driver never. Now the case narrowed down to a few unavoidable facts. The officer's stated reason began with tires chirping, squealing. Then, within moments, it turned into ordering him out, handcuffing him, and arresting him. Then it got written up with racing-related wording, racing on highways, aiding and abetting type language, serious enough to justify the jail decision. And later, that charge was dismissed. So the lawsuit forced the city to answer the cleanest, most damaging question in the whole situation. What specific facts justified turning a minor traffic allegation into a custodial arrest? That's where the pressure lives. Because if the reports don't clearly explain that jump, the jump looks like what Harmon said it was: an unlawful escalation. And if the footage shows the escalation happening faster than the facts can support, the footage becomes the loudest witness in the room. From that point on, the case wasn't about how the officers felt that night. It was about what they could prove, what they could justify, and whether the record showed a normal traffic stop or a decision made early, that Harmon was going to be treated as a threat. Once Harmon filed the lawsuit, the story stopped being something you only tell your close friends. It started moving. Quiet at first, through group chats, family calls, coworkers, people who heard the what happened version and immediately wanted the how did it get that far version, because the details didn't sound like a normal traffic stop. A tire chirp isn't supposed to end with an overnight jail stay. So when people heard that part, minor reason, major outcome, they didn't need a long explanation to understand what the problem was. They focused on the same thing every time. Why did it escalate? And because Harmon wasn't just any traveler, he was a Chicago police officer, the story hit differently. If someone trained in traffic stops can still get handled like that on a visit, what happens to the average person who doesn't know the language, doesn't know what questions to ask, and doesn't have any credibility built into their job title? That's the question that kept following the story as it spread. The more people talk about it, the harder it gets to pretend it was normal. That's when the situation shifts from one person's night to a city's problem, because attention changes the stakes. Harmon didn't just lose a night. He lost the assumption that a minor stop stays minor when the wrong officer decides it won't. Because what happened to him was simple in its shape, even if it was heavy in consequence. He came to Tempe for a birthday weekend, drove a rental performance car, got stopped over an alleged tire chirp, and ended up handcuffed, arrested, and held overnight on a racing-related misdemeanor that later got dismissed. That sequence is the whole reason the story didn't end with, well, at least he's out. It ended with a lawsuit. And when a city gets sued over a stop like that, the public usually wants one dramatic moment, one clip, one confession, one clear gotcha. But real accountability rarely looks like that. Real accountability looks like a city being forced to answer in writing why the escalation happened at all. It looks like officers having to stick to one consistent explanation without changing the story to fit the outcome. It looks like supervisors and attorneys asking questions nobody asks on the roadside, like, what exactly justified cuffs? What exactly justified jail? What exactly justified calling it racing? Because once the charge is dismissed, the "it was justified" argument gets weaker. And once a lawsuit is filed, the "it was just a misunderstanding" argument gets risky. Harmon, meanwhile, had his own consequences to carry, ones that don't show up as neatly as a dismissal order. He had the memory of being treated like a threat in a city he was visiting. He had the embarrassment of being booked, fingerprinted, and held overnight over something that should have been handled as a minor issue. He had to explain it to people who weren't there, people who hear arrest and don't always wait for dismissed. And he had to live with the core question that sits under his allegations, whether the escalation was triggered by evidence or by assumption. That's why the lawsuit mattered to him. Not because it could undo the night, because it forced the system to deal with the night as more than just one stop. And whether the case ends through motions, a settlement, or a trial, the ripple effect is the same. Once a city is pushed into that process, it can't pretend the escalation never happened. Here's the lesson that lands hardest in stories like this. On the street, authority moves fast. But later, the record moves slow. And slow is where the truth has room to breathe. That's why the smallest moments matter. The initial reason for the stop. The exact point where commands turn into restraints. The moment a minor issue got relabeled into something bigger. Because those are the moments that reveal whether a stop was about safety or about control. So let me ask you something. If you were in Harmon's position, traveling off duty, doing nothing that should have led to jail, what would you have done when the stop started escalating? Would you have stayed calm and focused on the record? Would you have tried to talk your way out of it? Or would you have assumed they'll realize it's minor and been shocked when they didn't? Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've ever had a small stop turn into something that felt way bigger than it should have been. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this, someone who thinks preparation, calm, and documentation don't matter, share it with them. Most importantly, subscribe for more story times like this, realistic, grounded, and focused on accountability, because the next one is just as hard to watch and even harder to ignore.
Hands up! Do not reach for your waistband! We got reports of shots fired!
My hands are up, sir. I don't have a gun.
We don't know what's in your hands. Drop whatever you're holding.
It's a speaker and a phone. That's it. We can see it from here.
Nobody heard any gunshots. I told you, I'm not armed. I'm not trying to hurt anybody. Please.
This happened right in there on a residential street in Seattle, and it almost turned fatal in minutes. On that block, the voices collided in the dark, police yelling from behind rifles, a young black man trying to explain what was in his hands, and neighbors refusing to let the situation be misunderstood. Because one detail was already shaping everything. Someone had called 911, claiming there were shots and that everyone was going to die. And when officers arrived believing that, the margin for error becomes almost non-existent. Before we continue, where are you watching from? City, state, country? Drop it in the comments. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this don't spread on their own, and your support helps bring these moments into the light. Now listen, because what happened next wasn't just tense. It was a reminder of how fast a false narrative can turn an unarmed person into a target. The young man in the yellow sweater was Jalen, early 20s, unarmed, no gun in his waistband, no weapon in his hands. Just a phone and a Bluetooth speaker that was still playing music, like Jalen was clinging to the only thing that made him feel steady. He wasn't acting like someone planning violence. He was acting like someone in an emotional spiral, breathing hard, voice shaky, trying to stay in control of his body, while strangers aimed rifles at him. And the police didn't walk up calmly to confirm what they were seeing. They took positions from a darker stretch of street, kept their distance, and aimed rifles toward Jalen, as if the speaker in his hand could suddenly become something else. The officers kept repeating the same concern, saying they needed to make sure Jalen didn't have a gun. Jalen kept repeating the same message back, telling them he didn't have a weapon, telling them he had nothing on him, and explaining that what he was holding was just a speaker. He stayed respectful, even calling them sir, like politeness could protect him. But the problem was bigger than Jalen's words. The problem was the call that came in before police ever laid eyes on him. Whoever called 911 didn't say there was a guy upset outside. They reported the worst possible version. And once that kind of report hits the radio, a normal object can get treated like maybe a gun, and a scared pause can get treated like non-compliance. That's how tragedies get manufactured, one assumption stacking on top of another. The only reason this didn't move in that direction is because Jalen wasn't alone. Not for long. Neighbors were already outside when police arrived. Some had seen Jalen earlier and understood what this really was. A young guy having a moment and trying to cool off. He'd been upset, stepped outside, and at one point, slapped a stop sign in frustration. One loud metallic smack. And then music started playing. That was it. No gunshots, no chaos. just stress spilling over in public. So when the cruisers showed up and rifles came out, the neighbors recognized the danger immediately, not from Jalen, but from the way Jalen was being treated. You could hear it in their voices. They weren't yelling to be disrespectful. They were yelling to correct the story before it got someone hurt. They called out what was obvious from their angle. Jalen was holding a phone, and he had nothing on him. One neighbor even said outright that the rifles were making the community more afraid than Jalen was, and demanded the officers calm down. That wasn't dramatics. That was honest fear. Because everybody on that street understood the basic math. When rifles are aimed at a panicked person and the shouting keeps escalating, the risk doesn't go down. It goes up. Jalen stood there with his hands raised, trying to obey while also trying not to fall apart. The speaker stayed in one hand, the phone stayed in the other, and the officers kept barking commands that didn't always match each other. One wanted him to drop what he was holding. Another wanted him to move. Another wanted him frozen. And Jalen, already overwhelmed, looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle where the wrong answer could cost him everything. He kept repeating the same facts, like he was trying to build a shield out of the truth. No weapon, no gun, just a phone and a speaker. On the sidewalk, more neighbors stepped out. More phones came up. People began filming from different angles. Because if this went bad, they wanted the world to know what they saw. And it matters. Because when there are witnesses close enough to see what's in someone's hands, it becomes harder to rewrite the story later. The officers, though, stayed locked into the 911 framing. They spoke and moved like they were dealing with someone armed, someone dangerous, someone who had to be controlled from a distance. Jalen kept speaking like a person begging to be seen correctly, repeating again that he didn't have any weapon. The neighbors backed him up louder, pointing out again what was in his hands. One neighbor, with a steady camera voice, narrated the visible details clearly. Hands up, phone, speaker, no weapon. Another neighbor kept talking directly to Jalen, telling him to stay where he was, move slowly, and breathe. Because they weren't just watching police. They were watching Jalen's panic rise in real time, and they knew how quickly a scared movement can get misread. Then the officers leaned into a new justification. They said they couldn't see clearly. They blamed lighting. They said they needed Jalen closer to confirm what was in his hands, while still keeping rifles trained from the same distance. It created a dangerous loop. Police stayed back with rifles, then blamed the distance for why they couldn't confirm what the neighborhood was already confirming with their own eyes. And the longer that loop went on, the more tense Jalen became. He wanted to comply, but the situation was set up so any movement could be interpreted as the wrong movement. A small shift of weight got shouted at. A glance downward got shouted at. Any lowering of his hands, even slightly, triggered more yelling. That's the trap of encounters like this. The person with the least power is expected to perform perfect calm under the most pressure. Then the commands collided again. One officer demanded Jalen walk toward them. Another demanded he get on the ground. Jalen hesitated, caught between two instructions that couldn't both be followed at the same time. His knees bent like he was about to kneel. Then he stopped. Then he tried to speak again, like he was trying to keep the officers talking instead of reacting. The neighbors saw it immediately. That hesitation wasn't defiance. It was overload. They got louder. They told officers to stop yelling at him, insisted he wasn't armed, and called out that the police were escalating the situation. The officers ordered people to back up, but the neighbors didn't disappear. They didn't rush the officers. They didn't touch the officers. They didn't try to handle Jalen themselves. They stayed close enough to witness, close enough to film, close enough to keep reality in the room. And that's when one bystander made the move that changed everything. His name was Evan. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't performing. He was watching the logic of the situation collapse. He could see the pattern. Police kept their distance, kept rifles up, demanded Jalen prove he wasn't armed, and used "we can't see" as the reason the standoff had to continue. Evan stepped forward carefully with his hands visible and his body language calm, doing exactly what police say they want from the public. Then he offered a solution. He asked Jalen if he wanted him to walk up with him, and he made sure the officers heard it. An officer accepted immediately, but Jalen, overwhelmed, refused, making it clear he wasn't walking toward rifles. He said he was just getting on the ground. Evan didn't argue with him. He stayed close anyway. He positioned himself right beside Jalen, close enough that Jalen wasn't isolated anymore, close enough that officers had to acknowledge people were willing to stand with him. Around them, more neighbors tightened in, not to confront police, but to make it impossible for Jalen to be treated like a faceless threat. And the officers, still holding rifles, had to confront a new reality. This wasn't going to happen in silence. It wasn't going to happen unseen. And if they made the wrong decision here, there would be evidence, witnesses, and a community ready to tell the truth. And then the police did something that said a lot without saying it directly. They went to the radio. Over the police radio, officers reported that community members were actively hindering them. They framed the neighbors' presence, people filming, people calling out what they could see, as interference. And that's the part you need to sit with. Because the neighbors weren't blocking a rescue. They weren't surrounding officers. They weren't touching anyone. They were witnessing and correcting a false narrative in real time. But to the officers, that kind of public accountability can feel like a problem because it reduces the space for, I thought I saw and I felt threatened later on. So on the radio, the officers asked for permission to disengage. They weren't asking because Jalen suddenly became less of a threat. They were asking because the situation had become too visible to control. The street looked thin, nearly 20 people watching, and several neighbors closed around Jalen, close enough that there was no way to claim they didn't know what was in his hands. Jalen, still shaken, did what he'd been saying he wanted to do all along. He got down, slowly, carefully. The neighbors kept talking to him as he moved, telling him to stay calm and go slow. And finally, the instruction came back. The officers were told they could back off. Officers began stepping back. No arrest, no found weapon. And as the cruisers pulled away, the neighbors didn't celebrate. They didn't spike the moment for the camera. They did what people do after something that almost goes horribly wrong. They exhaled, checked on Jalen, and tried to bring him back down to earth. By the next morning, what happened on that block wasn't staying on that block. Neighbors had videos from multiple angles, and those clips started circulating fast. First in local group chats, then wider. As it spread, police radio language became part of the conversation too, especially the claim that community members were hindering. Some people tried to frame the neighbors as the problem, but the neighborhood pushed back with one simple point. They didn't interfere with safety. They created it by staying present, filming, and repeating the visible facts so the situation couldn't be rewritten afterward. And for Jalen, the aftermath wasn't viral. It was personal. He still had to come down from the fear and adrenaline of being treated like a threat while already in crisis. The neighbors checked on him, made sure he wasn't alone, and kept the focus where it belonged. This should never have gotten that close. The neighborhood understood the hard truth. Jalen's safety that night came from a community refusing to step back and let a false story control the outcome. And Jalen, whether he said it out loud or not, was left with a different kind of reality too, knowing that people on his block didn't just watch. They stood with him when it mattered. By the end of that week, the story had settled into something the neighborhood couldn't unsee. On paper, police could describe it as a response to a high-priority call. They could say they acted out of caution. They could point to procedure and talk about uncertainty in the dark. But the people on that block remembered the part that mattered most. Jalen was never armed. Jalen never had a gun. Jalen was holding a phone and a speaker, and he was having a crisis, nothing more. And that's what made the night so dangerous. Because once a false shots fired narrative enters the system, It doesn't just bring police to your street. It brings a mindset that treats every movement like a threat and every pause like guilt. In that mindset, the truth doesn't automatically win. The truth has to be seen. The truth has to be said out loud. The truth has to be recorded. That's what the neighbors did. They didn't fight the police. They didn't take over the scene. They didn't turn it into chaos. They did something more effective. They refused to let Jalen be isolated, and they refused to let the story be rewritten while it was still happening. They gave Jalen something a lot of people don't get in moments like this: a circle of witnesses close enough to say confidently what was real. And because of that, Jalen went home that night alive. Not because the system worked perfectly, because the community did. So here's the question for you. If you were on that sidewalk, what would you have done? Would you have backed away and hoped for the best? Or would you have stayed present, filmed, and calmly repeated what you could see? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story hits you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life story times like this, because these stories don't get told unless we keep telling them.
This is your last chance. Roll the window all the way down and step out of the vehicle. Now.
My hands are up, officer. I'm not armed. I'm on my way to pick up my son from school. I'm just asking why this is turning into something more than a traffic stop.
You're being non-compliant. You're refusing lawful...
When the officer raised his baton toward the driver's side window, Andre already knew what was coming. He sat in the driver's seat with both hands high on the steering wheel. The officer stood inches from the window, telling Andre that this was his last chance, that if he did not follow every instruction exactly as ordered, the window would be broken and he would be pulled out. Andre tried to keep his voice steady as he spoke through the small gap of the half-open window. He told the officer that his hands were visible, that he was not armed, that he was on his way to pick up his son from school. He repeated that he was not refusing anything. He was only trying to understand why this simple traffic stop was suddenly being treated like a dangerous arrest. The officer responded that Andre was non-compliant, that he was ignoring lawful commands, that his behavior was suspicious and a threat to officer safety. He told Andre that any hesitation to exit the vehicle would be taken as defiance. He warned that if Andre did not step out immediately, force would be used. All of this was happening with a child's backpack visible on the passenger seat and a navigation app on the phone showing a route to an elementary school. The baton hovered near the window. The officer said this was the final warning. Just before the glass shattered, Andre thought about how many times this had happened to him in less than a year. 4 traffic stops. 4 variations of the same fear. Each time the justification had been something small. A light that supposedly flickered, a lane change questioned, a routine check. Each time he had wondered whether the next command would be the one that turned routine into something else. This time the escalation felt different. It felt deliberate. If someone had a baton raised toward your car window right now, how would you react? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories about real-life encounters, racism, and accountability matter to you, tap like and subscribe so more people see these breakdowns. Earlier that afternoon, Andre had been driving through San Diego's streets he knew his entire life. He was a native of the city, a construction worker, and a father of 2. On this particular day, his focus was simple: reach his son's school on time. His car was not new, but it ran. He followed a route he had taken many times. At one intersection, he rolled to a full stop at a stop sign, looked both ways, and then continued. He did it almost automatically. There was nothing dramatic about it. A few blocks later, he noticed police lights in his rearview mirror. He understood what that meant. He signaled, pulled over promptly to the side of the road, put the car in park, and set both hands on the steering wheel. He lowered his window partway and kept his phone mounted on the dashboard recording. He was not speeding. He had not swerved. There had been no near miss with another vehicle. The only thing he could think of was that stop sign. The first officer approached the driver's side, already carrying an edge in his posture. He asked Andre if he knew why he had been stopped. Andre replied that he did not. The officer told him that he had run the stop sign back there. and that this was the reason for the traffic stop. Andre knew he had stopped completely, but he also knew from experience that debating that detail at the roadside rarely led anywhere useful. He stated calmly that he believed he had come to a full stop. The officer took that as backtalk and reminded Andre that failing to acknowledge the violation was not helping him. When the officer demanded license and registration, Andre did not immediately move to retrieve them. Instead, he asked the officer to clarify the legal grounds for the stop and whether there was any evidence beyond the officer's word. Andre believed that without a valid reason, he was not obliged to hand over documents. He had been pulled over too many times recently to treat each justification as automatically honest. The officer instructed Andre to lower the window all the way. Andre already had it halfway down. He could be heard clearly. He stated that he was comfortable with it at that level and that he could still comply with any instruction. The officer interpreted that boundary as resistance. His tone sharpened. He said that full visibility was necessary and that Andre's preference didn't matter. He repeated the order to roll the window all the way down. Andre stayed calm. He stated that he was not refusing and that he was willing to cooperate, but he also mentioned that he was recording and that his hands were in plain sight. He asked if he was being treated as a threat for any specific reason. The officer did not provide a clear reason. Instead, he shifted to a familiar script. Mention of non-compliance, warnings about consequences, references to danger. He told Andre that if he did not immediately obey every command, he would be removed from the car. A second police vehicle arrived. A backup officer stepped out and moved toward the passenger side. Now Andre had 2 uniforms around him, 2 body cameras, and the static tension that comes when one officer feeds off another's assumptions. The second officer asked quietly what was going on. The first officer told her that the driver had run a stop sign and was now acting suspicious, refusing to roll the window all the way down and not exiting the vehicle promptly when told. He described Andre as potentially armed and dangerous, even though he had seen no weapon, no sudden movement, no direct threat. Andre heard the phrase armed and dangerous and understood what it meant in practice. Justification for force, justification for a sudden escalation. He repeated from his seat that he was unarmed, that he was a construction worker heading to pick up his son, and that he wanted to keep his hands visible and record the interaction for his own safety. The first officer did not respond to the content of those words. Instead, he raised his voice and declared that Andre was refusing lawful commands. He warned that failure to exit the vehicle immediately would result in officers having to extract him. He stated that this would include breaking the window if necessary. The second officer watched Andre closely. From her position, she could see his shoulders, his hands, the quiet rise and fall of his chest. She said more to the first officer than to Andre that the driver appeared calm. The first officer rejected that assessment. He argued that calm behavior could be a tactic, that in his experience, drivers could switch from calm to violent quickly. He repeated that hesitation itself was a warning sign. Andre was now faced with a choice he knew too well: either exit the car in a way that made him feel exposed and unsafe, or stay seated and be labeled non-compliant. He tried one more time to slow things down. He stated that he was willing to exit, but wanted to understand whether he was being detained for a simple traffic infraction or something more, and whether he was under arrest. The warning was repeated. If Andre did not exit the vehicle immediately, the window would be broken and he would be removed by force. The baton was lifted. The second officer murmured that the driver did not appear to be resisting. The first officer decided that this did not matter. The baton came down on the glass. The first strike was enough to fracture the window into a tight web of cracks. A second blow pushed the fragments inward. The glass broke away in a sudden burst, scattering pieces across Andre's lap, the seat, and the pavement outside. Some shards grazed his forearms and neck, but he kept his hands up. As soon as the opening was large enough, the first officer reached in through the broken window. He grabbed Andre's wrist in a hard grip and used the leverage to yank the door handle from the inside. The door swung open. Andre's was pulled sideways toward the gap. Andre did not swing, shove, or twist toward the officer. He tried to move with the direction of the pull to avoid making any sudden movements that could be interpreted as resistance. Despite that, the officer began issuing rapid commands, telling Andre commands that overlapped each other, even as Andre was already being physically dragged from the car. Once Andre's feet hit the ground, the officer twisted his arm behind his back and walked him forward several steps before leaning him against the side of the car. The motion was rough enough to make Andre's shoulder ache. His cheek came close to the metal, and he could feel glass crunching under his shoes. The second officer moved to the other side of Andre's body and assisted in bringing his other arm behind him. Together, they secured handcuffs around his wrists. During this, Andre kept his voice as level as he could manage. He stated more than once that he was not resisting and that he had not made any sudden movements. The officers did not acknowledge that. They continued to frame their own actions as a response to resistance, even though the physical reality did not match that description. With the cuffs in place, they guided him, more by pressure than guidance, to sit down on the curb. From that low angle, he could see his own car at eye level, the broken window a jagged opening where his control over the situation had ended. Then officers began to search his car. The search was not accompanied by a request for consent. There was no explanation offered that would justify treating this as anything more than a traffic stop. The officers moved through the interior of the car methodically, opening the glove compartment, checking the center console, looking under the seats, and examining the backpack on the passenger seat. Inside the backpack, they found nothing illegal, only school-related items. In the glove compartment, they found ordinary paperwork, insurance documents, and other mundane items. Under the seats, they found nothing of significance. Despite the fact that there was no sign of contraband, weapons, or evidence of any crime beyond the alleged traffic violation, the officers continued to operate as if their initial decision to escalate had been justified. A woman parked on the opposite side of the street had already begun recording on her phone from inside her own vehicle. From her angle, the footage captured the smashed window, the extraction, the handcuffing, and the calm posture Andre maintained throughout. The first officer finished searching the interior and stepped back out of the car. He announced to the second officer, to his own body camera, that the driver had refused lawful commands, that he had been non-compliant, and that force had been necessary for officer safety. He did not mention that no weapon had been found, no contraband had been discovered, and that the only threatening action Andre had taken was to question the legitimacy of the stop and withhold his documents. Andre listened to this version of events as it was spoken in real time. He understood that these words would later appear in reports, in justifications, possibly in court. He knew that the phrase non-compliant would be repeated, and that it could easily overshadow the fact that he had kept his hands visible, remained seated, and spoken calmly. Eventually, the officers brought him to his feet. The first officer informed him that he was under arrest. The charges referenced were the familiar cluster that often appears in such incidents: resisting, obstructing, delaying an officer in the performance of duty. The alleged rolling through the stop sign was now almost secondary. The traffic pretext had served its purpose. Andre was walked to the patrol car and placed in the back seat. From that position, his thoughts narrowed to a few sharp points. He was aware that his skin color, his refusal to surrender his documents without what he believed to be lawful cause, and his insistence on recording had combined into a set of factors the officer had read as defiance and danger. From beginning to end, the system treated the officer's statements as the default truth and his actions as the problem to be explained. For Andre, the repetition of being pulled over, questioned, and treated as suspicious without meaningful explanation had accumulated into a heavy weight. This latest escalation, with a smashed window and an arrest, turned that weight into something harder, a determination to challenge the way the story would be written about him. The incident moved from being only a personal trauma to being a potential case. After the arrest, Andre decided he would not let the broken window and the non-compliant label become just another line in a police report. He collected what evidence he could. His own phone recording showed him seated with his hands visible. A bystander's video showed the officer smashing the window and pulling him out while he stayed controlled. When his case was reviewed by lawyers, the pattern was clear. He was a black driver stopped on a disputed traffic claim, treated as armed and dangerous without any real basis, forced out of the car, searched, arrested, and then described on paper as the problem. The lawsuit they filed against the San Diego Police Department focused on 4 main points: excessive force, illegal search, unlawful arrest, and racial profiling. In legal terms, the argument was simple. There was no solid reason to treat him as a threat. His refusal to hand over documents and fully lower the window by itself did not justify breaking the glass and dragging him out. The search of his car was done without consent and without real probable cause. The way he was treated fit into a wider pattern of black drivers being stopped and escalated on weak pretexts. As the case moved forward, internal investigators and city lawyers had to compare the officers' written reports to the actual footage. Faced with public attention, video evidence, and legal pressure, the city agreed to settle. Andre received compensation for the damage, the arrest, and the impact on his life. More importantly, the case pushed the department to adjust its policies. The changes were not dramatic, but they were real. Tighter rules on when officers and renewed attention to racial patterns in traffic stops. Inside the department, the incident did not stay invisible. The officer who smashed the window faced discipline and a sustained finding that his use of force was out of line. The case was used in training as an example of what happens when non-compliance is used as a catch-all instead of dealing with what is actually in front of the officer. For Andre, the settlement did not erase the memory of glass hitting his lap or the feeling of being pulled out in front of strangers. It did not remove the tension he still felt when patrol lights appeared behind him, but it did give him something most people never get: official recognition that what happened to him was wrong, not just unfortunate. Over time, his case became one of those examples people in the community pointed to when they talked about policing and race. It showed how quickly a routine stop could be escalated and how critical it was to have cameras, records, and the willingness to challenge the official version. The larger lesson was straightforward. Power will often describe calm resistance as danger, especially when the person in the driver's seat is black. But when that story is confronted with evidence and pushed into the open, it can be challenged. Policies can shift. Future stops can play out differently, even if only slightly, because one person refused to let their experience be quietly filed away. For anyone watching this story, the questions are direct. Would you have had the courage to hold your ground the way Andre did? Have you seen traffic stops where the reaction didn't match the reality? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you know someone who needs to understand how these situations actually play out, send this story to them. And if you want more real, grounded stories about racism, power, and accountability, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one.